Good morning, boys and girls. Today we are going to continue to learn about the events that led up to the American Revolution. Today's focus is the Boston Massacre. Our learning objective for today's lesson. Students will describe how the Boston Massacre led to the American Revolution by analyzing and explaining what happened and the outcome. So today you're going to be learning a lot about the events of the Boston Massacre, what exactly happened and why, and what the outcomes were that ultimately led to the American Revolution, the war between the colonists and the British. So let's start out by discussing where the Boston Massacre happened, when it happened, and who it started with or who it involved. So the Boston Massacre happened, just like what its name says, in Boston, which is in Massachusetts. At the time, Boston was a colony that was being ruled by the British. By the year 1700, there was a lot of tension in Boston. A lot of the colonists were not happy with the British control, and they felt the need to do something. So on March 5th, 1770, that's when the Boston Massacre started. Who started it? Well, it was the colonists who really started it. Like I just said, they were not happy with the British control. So the colonists, which consisted of the day laborers, the apprentices, the merchant sailors, they decided that enough was enough and they were going to begin to retaliate. So what happened? So if you take a look at this picture, you can see this is an image from the Boston Massacre. You can kind of see that there's two groups of people. The people in the red are the soldiers, and the people in the blue are the colonists. You can see that they're in the square in Boston, and you can see that the colonists are holding up their guns, and it seems as if they're firing away because I see people on the ground, and I see a cloud of smoke behind them. So what exactly happened to cause the soldiers to start firing their weapons? So the colonists were very upset with the new taxes that the British were imposing. So there were taxes such as the Stamp Act, the Townshend Act, the Tea Act. The British were imposing the colonists to pay money for goods and services, money that they didn't have to pay for prior to the British control. There was a big saying, no taxation without representation. The colonists thought that they weren't being properly represented by the British. So they started shouting at the soldiers. They started harassing them, calling them names and saying they're no good. And ultimately, they picked up sticks and snowballs and they started throwing them at the British soldiers. Now, do you think the British soldiers just stood there and took it? No, they were going to retaliate. They retaliated by firing their weapons. So the colonists were protesting as a way of being upset with their taxes, but then their protest became violent. So what was the outcome? So as a result of the Boston Massacre, 5 colonists died. So the soldiers shot and killed 5 of the colonists. 13 people were arrested in the process. 8 of them were British soldiers, 1 of them was an officer, and 4 of them were civilians, civilians just being people that were there, most likely colonists. Now, the soldiers were arrested because of the violence that came about. The colonists thought that they could have handled it without violence. This ultimately led to the American Revolution. So the soldiers that were arrested, they were given a fair trial and they were found not guilty. It was a simple act of self-defense. So as you can see, the colonists still were not happy. They had some joy in the fact that the soldiers were arrested, but then the soldiers were found not guilty. So they didn't get exactly what they wanted. So this is why this event continued to lead up to the American Revolution. The next event that happens is the Boston Tea Party. So again, that's another event where the colonists retaliate against the British. So ultimately, the colonists were not going to be happy until the British were no longer in control. What you guys are going to do now is you're going to complete a little activity that has about 5 questions to demonstrate your understanding of the Boston Massacre. You can refer back to this lesson and the slides to help you answer those questions, but ultimately I'll be checking to make sure that you are able to fully describe the Boston Massacre. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask, and you may begin.